contention of a possible judgment debt staring Ghanaians in the face has brought to the fore the culture of irresponsible usage of state resources. Government might be paying $1.5 billion to African Automobile Limited in judgment debt for failure to pay about 87 cross-country vehicles imported in 1999, delivered in 2001, that have gone waste. They've never been used. There is also the case of Kufuor's affordable housing project, which was started in 2006, that is also wasting away countrywide. They've been taken over by squatters who are paying rent to a man gone AWOL. We can also recall the case of the Gulfstream jet procured by former President Rawlings that was never used by the Kufuor administration, who after some time traded it in for 4 K-8 military aircrafts and 1 K-8 flight simulator for the Ghana Air Force from China National Aerotechnology Import and Export Corporation. Now, in 1999, the then opposition leader, John Agyekum Kufuor, made this issue a major political issue and promised never to use this jet when voted into power. Of course, he stuck to his vow. Tonight, we'll focus on the avoidable, costly waste of state resources that is becoming a norm. How do we prevent these losses? Must we chart a different policy direction? Should we be looking at strengthening our contract laws? Is anybody doing due diligence on some of these contracts? And how do we prevent politicians and political heads from incurring wasteful cost through sheer political considerations? So, do we need a legal solution to the matter? You can join us with your comments and contributions via our text code 1760 or post them on our Facebook wall, facebook.com/MultiTV Ghana. Tonight on PM Express, the contention of another judgment is still staring us in the face. And I have in the studio with me Kofi Abochi, who is senior lecturer from Gimpa Law School. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
And then I also have Selom Brantier, who is communications director for Imani Ghana Limited. On the phone, we'll have Paul Nanakwabena Abrompa Mensah, who is programs officer for the Center for Democratic Development, CDD. And then also I'll have Vitus Azim, executive director of Ghana Integrity Initiative. Gentlemen, if you're on phone and you can hear me, welcome. And welcome to PM Express. Let's start with you, Mr. Kofi Abochi. This issue has been on the news and you've been discussing on different platforms. Tell me, what do you foresee happening in terms of wastage from this angle of judgment debts?
What do I foresee happening in terms of the outcome? Wastage. Maybe I quite don't understand the question, but what do I foresee happening? I think clearly we have a problem on our hands as a country. I think as a country we still haven't come to terms with certain realities of governance. My worry is that it seems that we are constantly in the throes of politics. We don't seem to ever come out of the political cycle and enter into the realm of governance. I think our electoral cycle, our administration of our elections and everything in this country, unfortunately, probably doesn't help matters. I do not have ready solutions on hand. But what I can say for a fact is that it does seem clear that we have problems with institutions and we have not been able to manage our various transitional processes and outcomes well, to the extent that even when there are changes in government, the new government continues the old political cycle. And so we do not manage the post-electoral processes well. We do not manage the handing over processes and transitional issues well. And that tends to feed into all these problems we're experiencing today in terms of state asset management, among others. So if you ask me what I do foresee, I think that we still do have cause to worry, because unfortunately the courts are not in the business of politics. And so regardless of how you play your political cards, when you still end up in the courts are still going to treat you as they treat all other citizens. And government is just a single party to all contractual transactions. So if government messes up as far as its part of the contractual bargain is concerned, it will still have to suffer the commercial consequences of all breaches of contract. And in this case, unfortunately, you and I do bear the brunt of having to pay these through our taxes.
Now, Salam, let me rephrase the same question to you. Now, do you think that Ghana is endorsing a culture of wasting state resources, at least based on the premise we've just given?
Well, it's not even just a matter of endorsing some of these wasteful practices. I think that there is a very big absence of project management. And that, for me, is the core of the problem. If we had an attitude towards effective project management, from where we conceptualize a project and look at its pros and cons in terms of what benefits it gives politically, socially, economically, etc., and what it tends to benefit whoever the project is supposed to run for, or the objectives, then we'll be able to actually figure out what exactly needs to be done at what time, point A, point B, point C, so that over the course of the execution of the project, be it the purchase of cars, be it the, the erection of cheap housing, be it the procurement of aircraft or transportation equipment or whatever it is the objective that should drive the project forward. However, we are in a situation where everything is seen, as Kofi Abuchi said, through the political eye. And now, as far as that is always going to be done, or as far as it is in the past few regimes of the Fourth Republic, we've seen that there has been a constant intention by successive governments of different parties to discontinue previous projects, regardless of whether those projects had good objectives or not. So now what I see is that we do not have a culture of effective project management,
I mean, that's
which
the
is
point.
at the core of it.
You think that is to the core
that is the core
of the problem. And you don't
because
think these things are happening because of sheer political considerations?
That is what
only,
I'm saying.
really?
Because you see, if we had the sense of good project management, we would even sidestep the political issues and make sure that some of these projects are executed. Because who are the people who actually design some of these initiatives are not politicians. They are the bureaucrats sitting in the ministries, sitting in the departments and agencies and wherever. And if they are doing it and the government is going to take credit for it, I mean, we should learn to sort of devolve the activity of governance and the activity of running projects that are supposed to benefit the nation. That is where I think there needs to be a clear distinction. However, that distinction is very blurred right now because governments always want to even take, credit for things that others have even thought about. And once the political figurehead in charge thinks that he should be the flagship personality behind this project, anyone else coming into it will think that, okay, fine, the shadow of whatever this guy tried to do is falling on mine, and therefore I have to clear his so that I also leave my legacy. I think that is the major problem here.
Let me go on the line to Paul Nana Kwabena Abrompa Mensah, Program Officer for CDD. Good evening, sir, and thanks for joining us.
Good evening, my brother. My greetings to Ernest and the other colleagues.
Now, from the governance perspective and from where you stand, tell me, do you think our political heads are incurring these wasteful costs because they want to begin new contracts all the time so they can cut corners, what has been known in our Ghanaian parlance as chop-chop?
Thank you, my brother. Let me start with the basic, simplistic analysis of the issue. I've been monitoring the media since these issues came up. And, some of our local radio stations sometimes open the phone lines and people do contribute. You hear people, the ice water sellers, the dog chain sellers, our market women, and some of the simple questions they ask. Sometimes we, the elite, must analyze them and see the effect, the impact, how the people feel the problems. A certain woman called and asked in chief that if it were to be their father's property or their family property, would they have handled it that way? That was the simple question a market woman asked. If you take it from that premise, if our leaders, our political leadership, people who manage our resources, have the commitment, the interest of the nation at heart, if they are handling their own property, their own resources, would they have allowed some of these things to go rotten? If your father has left you a car or some cars, vehicles worth $1.5 billion, would you have allowed the car to get rotten in the sun? These are some of the basic questions that we ask ourselves. So the question is not political expediency, but the parochial interest of some of our leaders, some of our public holders. We are in a part of the country, a part of the world, that you don't see a single anna from a director, a managing director, a chief executive, anybody within a certain ministry that has protested against a policy that is causing losses to the country. Almost any time something happens in the country, nobody comes out to protest against or bring out the rotten in specific offices, as happens elsewhere. When you go to developed countries, people openly come out and resign from a government because they are against certain policies that they think going to cause problems for the country. Here in the country, we don't have that. So the problem is not whether they are not aware of what is happening. They are aware, I believe, but because our leadership have been overwhelmed, they have taken their parochial interest ahead of national interest. That's why some of these things happen. Because sometimes you sit down and analyze the whole situation, and when issues come up, you will see defense coming from certain quarters, affiliate newspapers, certain supporters groups, even call in and phone in, support particular issues that you think, are these also not Ghanaians? Are they worried about the losses that the country is incurring? Why are they defending? Would they have defended these same issues if they were in the opposition? You ask simple questions and realize that no, people are handling affairs who do not have the national interest at heart.
It's obvious, Paul, you're very worried about the situation. Let me come back to the studio to you, Mr. Abochi. Is this waste a legal matter, or you would say is contractual failure or policy issues? Where exactly should we place the problem? Where should we fix this problem?
Well, it's invariably a legal matter. If there can be various disputations as regards what exactly the facts are, and I am mindful of the fact that I think government and the opposition then in government do disagree as to who exactly is accountable for this. But if you listen to the totality of the facts, and indeed this has been running for a while, I think the fundamental issue is this: when government enters into a contract, it is government that has entered into a contract. Government as a generic entity, not government as NDC or government as MPP. And I think in this regard, it's important for us to appreciate the continuity of government. It's important for our politicians to appreciate the continuity of government as opposed to the changes of governments. So there is a government in the sense of the political, which changes now and then, but there is a government which is generic and which is continuous. And I think if we appreciate that, when government is a party to a contractual transaction, regardless of the fact that a new government in power does not agree with the previous government in terms of the sensibility or otherwise, or the feasibility or otherwise of entering into this contract, it is still a contract. And the other party has all the entitlement to have the contract enforced, regardless of what the new government thinks. In that regard, any failure of enforcement would lead to consequences in court. And as I said, you and I bear liability for that. So it is important that whenever there's a new government, that government enforces to the latter all pre-existing contracts. There is the possibility or a window of opportunity for renegotiation of contracts. If government doesn't want to enforce a contract, what it does is to renegotiate the contract or possibly seek an exit point, which is less catastrophic as opposed to just failing to enforce, in which case they may go to court and then there are collateral consequences. So I think the key issue here is a failure to appreciate the essence of government, which is a continuous process for which cause a new government in power does not really change that generic understanding of government with outstanding liabilities that a new government in power is still obliged to uphold.
I know this is of major concern to many people, including myself, that the question people keep asking is, do we have legal advisors or people who have the responsibility to do due diligence to analyze these contracts when the new governments take over power? Do we have people like that whose job it is to scrutinize these contracts in governments?
Well, if you ask me, I do think that certainly there are. The technocrats in the ministries and departments and agencies are precisely the people with that kind of mandate and technical competence to properly advise government. But as is the same in many parts of the world, the political tends to trump the technical in some of these matters. And indeed, the very nature and structure of government is of such a nature that the political is ultimately responsible. And so when the technocrat advises, the political or the political head, which is a minister, can basically say, well, I'm not interested. And I think that for some of these major contracts, I think what we tend to see in this case is that there's probably minimal technical participation, and what you tend to have is that the political takes the lead. And again, I must hasten to add, from the standpoint of an ordinary participant in the general public, in the political discourse of Ghana, it does seem that for many of our contracts, people tend to stand back and have questions as regards the extent to which we actually negotiated on a fair pedestal, or the extent to which we actually negotiated from a rigorous perspective. And I can take an easy example. An easy example is what everyone is talking about the factor of, for instance, how much we're getting from our oil, the fact of how much we get from our natural resources.
And these are really fair questions.
These are fair questions.
Anybody to ask.
Absolutely. I mean, if you divide the resources of Ghana, percentage-wise, you and I should have our own respective percentages. And therefore, for whatever negotiation has been done in a manner that seems to have led to us being shortchanged, basically these are questions that we are fairly entitled to ask. So I think overall, if you ask from the standpoint of whether it is legal, policy, otherwise, it is a mixture of these. But I think generally speaking, once you have entered into a contract, and once even if you want to say that it's a bad bargain that you made, you are still obliged to see to the enforcement of that. Now, the successor in title, and in contracts we normally have that phrase that says it binds successors in title. The successors in title here of governments are all these political parties which are which variously come into power and exit power. But government as a generic entity is bound, and therefore we cannot say that we disagreed with a previous government entering into a contract, and therefore we are not going to enforce that. If you do that, you simply incur liability, and we may end up paying way more than we're supposed to have initially paid for basic contractual obligations.
Let's go on the telephone line again and speak to Vitus Azim, who is Executive Director of the Ghana Integrity Initiative. Good evening, sir, and thanks for joining us. You've been following the debate. Mr. Abrantier is saying that the core issue of all these problems is the absence of project management, whilst Mr. Abochi agrees that successive governments must make it their responsibility to see through contractual obligations. Is it not mind-boggling that a country like Ghana, which is so dependent on aid, would just be wasting our little resources in this manner?
I think it is outrageous that we should always just sit down and allow these things to happen. When a government comes into power, there should be at least some handing over notes. The technocrats do not go immediately. So you should have been briefed with regards to what is your commitments as a new government. But the issue is, if somebody, from the discussions that I've been hearing on air, if somebody walks into your office and says that, look, I have brought these things for your government, please, can I get payment? Does the person come verbally to say this? Don't you ask, can I have a written request for the payment with the necessary supporting documents? How can anybody on earth say that there were no supporting documents for this thing? I mean, these vehicles.
I know many people have asked the question, and I ask you again. Are you worried about this trend, which appears to be turning itself into a culture of wastefulness?
I am more than worried. It is outrageous. We waste resources paying these. How can these vehicles have been standing packed for 11 years? For two governments not to have taken any action on these vehicles. I'm not just worried. It is outrageous. And these are people that have elected to manage the affairs of this country, to handle the resource of this country in a way that will benefit the majority of Ghanaians.
I know that your group, the Ghana Integrity Initiative, has been concerned or fighting corruption in this country from various fronts. Do you think this is a corruption issue?
I think there is some potential or some possibility of corruption because, one, when you award contracts in election years, when you are just about to leave office, the possibility, I'm not saying that's what was the case with this issue, the possibility that you are looking for money to fund your campaigns. One, you are also putting on responsibilities on an incoming government in case you do not win. So the issue of personal interest comes in, and we define corruption as
using your entrusted power for private gain. So either you are looking for money for campaigns, or you are just trying to push a burden onto the next government, so that if they're not able to meet these responsibilities, then they'll be blamed and they may lose the interest. Now, so these are the two issues, and I think that, yes, there are possible corruption issues. Somebody may just award a contract at the end of the period so that you get some money for your pocket. There are individual interests, there are party interests. You cannot rule them out. There are possibilities. I'm not saying that that's the situation in this particular issue, because I don't have the evidence. But I think that it is a potential area of corruption.
Now, back to the studio, to you, Salam. You have been arguing the point that this problem emanates from our inability to institute efficient project management into our negotiations, etc., and to our contracts. Now, tell me, who do you think should be made responsible to ensure that these things from the angle of project management are implemented effectively? The past government or the government which took over power?
Well, I think that even before we even look at all this, historically as a country, we have always disregarded the effects and the power of contracts and how they can have a bearing on future events. I think you are a law lecturer. I remember when I was doing law in school, there was this case about a conveyance of land to someone in Kumasi. And the conveyance was for 999 years. And it was shown to us as an example of the inability of people to really scrutinize what they are trying to sign on. And if this happened, and this contract happened 100 years ago, now move 100 years forward, and you would realize that consistently since independence, we have always had situations where we've always had to pay, sort of, for contracts that we have signed without really taking very good cognizance of the effects that would come out of it. Quite a lot of times, even the basic due diligence is not done properly. There have been in situations where even in Mani, we have always come up and complained that some contracts that are going on haven't been really looked into. We should really look at the parties who are signing these things. Are we sure that the people have been investigated well to show that they can deliver on their promises or their sides of the issue? I think even from that perspective alone, Ghana has not done well as a nation. Now, to place the blame on a particular government or the other government is not the beginning or the end of the story.
And it's not the solution either.
It's not the solution. The solution is whether we are equipping the bureaucrats and the technocrats to look into these situations well enough, and whether their opinions are being heard by the political figureheads who are the ones who eventually, ratify some of these
But how do we equip bureaucrats and technocrats
when
we've been equipping them
for so long?
Is everywhere in the system.
We sponsor them to do their master's degrees.
Civil society groups.
Yeah, but look at every ministry. Look at the directors in all the ministries. Don't they have their respective master's degrees? Some of them even have double masters, even with MBAs, etc., etc. I mean, these are things that you learn going forward, even from the classroom and on the job. I think that what happens is that some of them might probably be doing their job, but the political figureheads overrun them anyway. And they go like, well, country broke, country no broke, we will stay inside. Let me do my thing, get my pay, and sit down quietly so that I'm not moved from my cozy position and my little perks. I think what should happen is that the technocrats should also be empowered a little bit more, and they should be able to have a say in some of these, issues. Now, going forward, even before we even look at the technocrats themselves, we also have to look at the fact that, as I said earlier, the need to really look at our projects and look at them very well has been something that we have never really done. If we look at almost all projects that we've done as a nation, we have always either fallen back and we have incurred sometimes even twice more than the initial budgeted amount. And some of these delays are probably due to somebody not signing the document at the right time, somebody being absent when he should have been present for a certain meeting, and not involving the right stakeholders in what is supposed to be done. I think it is we have adopted as a nation a very, very casual attitude to some of these important things, forgetting that with every dollar that is invested or every dollar that is loaned out or every grant that is given, we have to account for it in some form or the other. If you go to the World Bank right now, they will give you a whole list of projects that we haven't completed, we should have completed right now, 1. And then 2, there are stages of projects that we have to complete, even to access further funding that we haven't done. And yet we still go and negotiate for new funds to run some of those self-same projects. Sometimes it doesn't even need a different government to do that. Sometimes the same government will go and take 2 different grants or 3 different grants for the same subject matter or the same activity. And if we look at this, it is a grand wastage of resources, because you are going to take the same technical people to rewrite or rehash the same things they've written probably over the past 10 years. And when you do that, I mean, you are looking at almost self-plagiarization, because some of these bureaucrats themselves are just going to look at the old document, change the cover page, change the dates signed, and then still send the same document to access grants, which they know would only go halfway, and then the project will die off, because they've seen it happen over and over again. I think that a new culture of management at the MDA level should be enforced, or that would be the right way to go. A new culture of management, which would then allow some influence to be put on the political figureheads to also align themselves to some of the objectives of these ministries, without them having to push purely political agendas into the scenario.
We were exploring these issues. We've all discussed the details of it, where we are we're trying to find where the problem should be fixed. Now, let me come back to you, Lawyer Bochi. Is there a legal solution we should be exploring? And do you think that this will be effective?
Well, as I mentioned, government is a continuum. Therefore, contractual obligations assumed by government will be binding on future governments. I think moving forward, it's important that we deepen our institutions. If you investigate the rules and regulations on all these things, you'll be amazed at the fact that there is an adequacy of rules. And indeed, our governance framework has also been put in place, that there are sufficient checks and balances to ensure that even if you do not have absolute bipartisanship, you have some degree of opposition input, just to put it bluntly. You have some degree of the input of parties which are not necessarily in government. The problem with us, I think, is that we tend to rather reinforce the political, and in this case, the government political, as opposed to the government institutional. I think moving forward, the way to deal with this, to ensure that, using your word legal, to ensure that these things are put on a proper legal pedestal, and not just that, but that they actually do reflect a certain sense of necessity for a country like Ghana, so that future governments do not feel that these contracts are unnecessary, that as a people we have been shortchanged, and therefore they do not want to have anything to do with that. I think the only way we can really overcome this deficit is to ensure that we actually deepen the institutional aspects of doing these things, because contracts are negotiated, and to properly have to have a contract properly negotiated, you need to have the negotiating skills. You need to have the negotiating competence. You need to have the benefit of proper advice.
And you think our political leaders are not giving themselves the benefit of these negotiating skills?
Well, I think that in the light of the fact that you have various governments, and indeed it's interesting that the 2 parties that have ever been in government in the Fourth Republic both seem to have had issues with the respective subject matter. And I think you can mention them across the spectrum. The current one appears to have, started with the NDC. Yeah. And then the NPP apparently had issues, and probably they implemented it, if I get the facts correctly. I think if you look on this other side too, you have, for instance, a presidential mansion, which is still not being used as we speak for presidential purposes. So the 2 political divides appear to both have issues in respect of contracts that were inherited, or contracts, the subject matter of contracts that were inherited. I think to that extent, moving beyond these 2 parties and taking the thing from a global perspective, it is important that we deepen the institutional aspects. For instance, and I would mention Parliament. I think Parliament, I would want to single Parliament out for blame in this particular respect. I think that the Parliament of the Fourth Republic has been structured to be the most powerful institution in this country. Yeah. Unfortunately, it is the weakest. And the reason is because Parliament has allowed itself to be fragmented to a point that it has become an extension of governments in power. Therefore,
is it not what it's supposed to be?
Well,
really, because then if the majority in Parliament is on the governance side, you would expect decisions to be taken that way.
I totally disagree. Parliament is not structured to be an extension of government. Parliament is structured to collaborate with government constructively in governance, but more importantly, to check government, especially in its excesses. So if you look at the Constitution, Parliament has financial responsibilities. And these financial responsibilities are to take account of some of these things. And that is why you have some contracts, for instance, that are supposed to go before Parliament. Parliament is supposed to perform these auditing responsibilities. It is not for nothing that Parliament is in charge of budgeting. If Parliament is not able to do the pre-check, Parliament can do the post-check by taking advantage of the budget process and refusing to approve the estimates for the following year if there has been, for instance, sufficient indications of wastage. If you have all these cars that have gone waste, and in the next budget there is allocation for buying vehicles for certain ministries, I think Parliament is in its right senses to refuse to approve that budget and to request that remedial steps be taken in that respect before Parliament actually can approve future budgets in this respect. So I think the basic point I'm making is that there are auditing responsibilities on the part of Parliament, incumbent on Parliament. There are financial accountancy responsibilities on the part of and incumbent on Parliament that are designed to ensure that some of these waste we are experiencing doesn't happen. Because we shouldn't forget the fact that government as a part, so I'm talking about government as a political machinery, the party constituting government has a political agenda, has a parochial agenda. That parochial agenda is really to promote its political interest and to get re-elected, so to speak. But in terms of Parliament, Parliament is constituted with the bipartisanship impression of various political shades representing the various people of this country and designed to ensure that they put their brakes on government in terms of its, and government in a narrow sense, i.e. the executive, in terms of its wastages, for want of a better word, in terms of its excesses, and to ensure that the management of the state resources in Ghana are put on a prudent and efficient pedestal.
You also mentioned earlier that we have issues with our post-electoral process. Are you suggesting really that if, for example, the transition bill is passed into law and well implemented, will it solve this problem partly? The
transition law is certainly designed to rectify some of these things, but the transition law, it's in its current format, still deals with the transition per transition. But I'm looking at a transition really that goes beyond the immediate phase of election. And I'm just saying that we are constantly in the electoral cycle. The reason I make this point is that whenever governments come into power, they tend to really be thinking about what has happened before the election. That is one aspect. The other aspect is that if you look at the way the transition itself was managed and previous transitions, you find out that there are problems. As I think raised by Mr. Vitus Azim, the fundamental question is this: were they handing over notes? Were incoming ministers properly briefed in respect of existing and outstanding contracts, in respect of which government has obligations? Were incoming ministers sufficiently apprised of the subject matter of these contracts and the liabilities that are outstanding in case government doesn't follow through? In other words, were there proper briefing in respect of the exiting for the incoming? And I think that if you look at all these things, so that we have proper inventory taking, and not just proper inventory taking, but we have proper briefing in respect of contracts that actually led to certain transactions being effectuated. So if you look at all these things from the perspective of the fact that as a country, we don't ever seem to be out of the electoral cycle. There's never a bipartisanship. There's constant political bickering on all subjects. And just to finally tie this in with the fact that there is a need to distinguish the political from the state. And I think that's one aspect we haven't been able to handle very well. Any transaction that has the impression of state authority becomes that of a state transaction. It is not a political transaction. And if you look and listen to the entirety of the discussions, it looks as if we're constantly trying to identify something that is of a political wrong by a political party. But many of these things are state. And I think at that point, you and I bear the liability through our taxes. And I think that's where I have major difficulties with the way things have been handled.
Let's go on the line. If Mr. Paul Nana Kwabena Abrompa Mensah, if you're there, let's start quantifying these losses. I wouldn't call them losses, but let's quantify these issues that you know, from the premise we gave through the acquisition of the Gulfstream jet and then the Kufuor low-cost houses. If we quantify these, is it that very bad?
My brother, you first have to ask yourself, what is the total budget for the country for first, second, and third cycle institutions? What is the total budget for the country for agricultural subsidy that we're thinking of even the abolition? What's the total cost of the country that we need to implement our proposed one-time premium of the NHIS? When you quantify some of these things, then you hear specifics of some of these projects that have been abandoned or that have been handed over or contracted without proper due diligence. Then you can fathom the problem that we have at hand as a country. Don't also forget that no country is self-sufficient, but Ghana is always with CAP going out for support. So if you have such amounts there, and you have the men to handle our affairs, why don't we manage the little that we have before we go out for something? So the amount is not the effect, quantifying in mere standards as to how do I see it, but as to how much we need in these small items, let alone letting some of these big amounts go out. Yes, it has a greater effect on us, especially as a developing country. That little amount is planned to do something big. So yes, in that realm, we are losing so much. And I've been following my colleagues at the studio, and when you ask me what is the way forward, NS has said so much about that. The problem is, where are the institutions that have been put in place to manage these affairs? We have strong feeling and support for our parliament. Is parliament doing their work well? We have strong feeling and support for our technocrats in the various ministries that will believe they came through these ranks because of their competencies and their qualification, not by appointment. So it's expected that at least they will do due diligence and be honest to themselves and advise well. If the advice is not being taken, they will alert and let people know. Well, maybe as time goes on and the whistleblower bill is actually in place and all these things are happening, we might get better information about what is happening. But if you ask me the cost of some of these neglected projects and bias or wrongly entered contracts, I would say we've lost more than we can
Mr.
have.
Mensah, I know Salom and Mr. Kofi Abochi have been prescribing solutions. What is CDD's prescription for resolving these problems, which I keep saying problems, but what's CDD's prescription to this whole issue?
Well, my brother, I'll first talk about one. I think there should be external input into some of these problems. NS was, my other colleague was saying, same projects that has not been completed, same projects that have been abandoned. Successive governments come and apply to implement similar or same projects. Yet our donors do give funds. What happens over there? Let me give you a typical example of this Millennium Challenge account and the NHI. Look at the documents. According to when the issue came and they were assessing the progress and how they went to securing the amount, a whole committee was put in place. It was just more than even scrutiny and interview before the amount was given us. After the amount has been given to the country, there was constantly continuous reports from this country to the authority. So if we think that the donors can help us, there should be a modality to check what the previous amount was used for. What is the outcome before they pump in more money? That would be one. And secondly, I think some of these things come about because most of the projects that have been abandoned are projects of political parties, but they are not projects of the state.
But Mr. Mensah, let me stop you there. I mean, talking about donors, if we go back to former President Kufuor's low-cost housing, the government secured a $30 million loan agreement from the United States Overseas Private Investment Corporation. So does it not beg the question that how then do we go back to this same donor to say, help us streamline the money you give us next time?
That's the exact point I'm drumming home. Because most of the times they are aware of some of these things. And I don't want to go into some of the nitty-gritty. Sometimes you are there before a government goes to power, even November, August, September, they give a report that, oh, you have done well, the economy is good. As soon as that very government goes, a different report comes out quickly. So I'm saying the external the people, our donors, our assistants, our financiers are not helping us. They will have to be truthful with us. They have to scrutinize issues. They have to be straight and frank. If these things happen, I think it will curtail the modalities at which people use and the amount of wastage that we have in the system. That's one thing. They'll have to straight with us. And secondly, as I said, some of these projects, we look at it as if they are for political parties, as Ernest said. We have to have a state and a nationalistic policy. We have to have a policy that is for the country and not for a political party. So what we have is that if you have a national agenda, any political party that comes to power fits into that agenda. And when I say a national agenda, it should be an agenda that has been developed by whole stakeholders in the country. It's not only political party manifesto. When I come to power, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. The state wants to do this. When you come to power, what is your strategy that you're going to use and enforce what the state has drawn? I think if you have a national policy wholly developed by the entire state and political parties buy into it, some of these strategies will go down. And thirdly, we need to have a character as a nation. We need to have commitment. We need to have interest for the nation and think about the nation. If you have this commitment and nationalistic character, I think some of these things we feel it when we are committing the blunder for the state.
Well, you're watching PM Express live on Joy News on your multi-TV. My name is Stephen Enti, and we're discussing wasting state resources. You can join us on our Facebook, facebook.com/multi-TV Ghana. I have a few of your messages. Debayo Latif Oseni writes that this looming so-called judgment debt is fraud. It's just an avenue for political equalization on the side of the government. From all indications, there was no contract to procure these vehicles. In addition, even if we assume without admitting that government contracted African Automobile Limited to supply these vehicles, the initial cost per vehicle is suspicious. A galloper of over $160,000 in 1999. Further to this, how come the amount moved from 17 million to 1.5 million in 12 years? What's the interest rate? Maybe 750% per annum. And we're negotiating to bring it down to what? This, Latif says, is unacceptable. And then Zakaria Dabre writes, I don't think Ghanaians are ready for democracy. Why do I say so? Because MPP and NDC have turned the country as their personal properties. Our politicians are very selfish. And then Albert A. From APAM, he writes, we should approach national issues as non-partisan discourse because parties come, parties go. But Ghana remains, and there should be national policies that any party that comes should follow in order not to be spending recklessly our national resources. And Karim Ahmed Bediako says, which court did the Africa Automobile take the case to procure this $1.5 billion judgment debt? And who were those who formed the arbitration team and who paneled them? We need answers. And Kwejo Apia Emmanuel says, God is watching us. Saka Fuzu says, many judgment debts have popped up, but the most serious is Royal Miss, which needs urgent attention. William Amachi says, there are a lot of wastage of public funds in the system. I think there are a lot of paperwork which should be reduced and ensure regular patriotic supervision. Theophilus Apia says, God save Ghana from all this bad governance who don't think about the future of the youth, but only their families. Good thinking, products. So bad thinking, bad product. Oh, he says, good thinking, good product. Bad thinking, bad product. Alhaji Anas says it's simple because we don't make use of the various principal legal officers or technocrats at our ministries, departments, and agencies when signing these contracts or agreements, but rather allow political heads who probably might be well versed in legal issues. Or here, Chigozie says, we're watching from Nigeria because we feel that with information from Ghana, better policies are in place to emulate. Thanks for a message. Or here, Chigozie from Nigeria. And then Dixon Desire from Laura writes, did I hear that there is another judgment debt looming over the head of Ghanaians against over cars imported by the NDC government in 1999? Honorable Ablakwa and his boss, President Mills, should give Ghanaians a break. God save us. Gilbert Do Awonyo says, I hope our politicians be reminded that if people lose confidence in the political system, and the immediate alternative is people taking the laws into their own hands and explosions they may not be able to handle. And lastly, Legal Wam writes, from my little knowledge, we have institutions made up of bureaucracy or level of government administrative positions in relation to contract awarding and payment judgment debt itself. It visibly points out whom to attack when there is an irrational allocation of contract as well as undue payment. Let me come to the studio to you, Salom. Do you think it's now time for us to design or bring in policies that will compel governments to stick to contractual obligations of the previous governments when they come into power? They assume office, yeah?
There are two things. First of all, I think that there should be a contract management office, whether it is going to be a centralized one or one that will cover various ministries or group bands of ministries, I don't know. But there should be a contract management office which should probably be backed by law. And the people inside should be as secure as the people you find at IOCO or any other quasi-governmental institution, which will have direct oversight over aspects of contracts like due diligence, investigating the parties concerned, looking at some of the ramifications that could happen in terms of a breach or should anything else happen. And apart from that, there should also be, I think, it is now time that we designed as a government a new records management bill such that all contracts or all activities of states that require funds or public funds to be employed in some endeavor or the other, it is now time that we have a law that requires certain procedures to be standardized.
And you think that these contracts should be made public?
Exactly. It doesn't mean exactly they should be made public, because every contract has a different sort of spirit attached to it. But then there should be certain well laid out procedures such that if we are going to refer to contract A or contract B, which was signed by person C or D, we know that it was done at this particular time. The records are here. They were stored in this particular format. They can be accessed by X, Y, and Z. These are the rules that are governing even the storage of the documents, so that should we ever have to refer to anything, we know that there are clear and ambiguous statements that we can look up to and say that this is what happened and at what time. I mean, there have been countless situations where somebody comes up and says he has a contract with this government, or he has a contract with so and so, and then they say, where are the records? And the records are not found. So the next day, before you realize what has happened, the whole ministry gets burnt up, and then every other contract goes along with it. I think it is time that we really need to leverage. I mean, we are in the 21st century, for crying out loud. We need to leverage not just our legal system, but we need to leverage technology to make sure that some of these things are foolproof. Now, if we decide to do that and we have a very effective contract administration system put together, I think what we should do now is that we should have either two laws or one law bound together, a contract administration and records policy or bill, for instance. That should be looked at. We should have technical stakeholders come in and say that we are empowering all these people, those who sign the contracts, those who design the contracts, those who consult and do due diligence and all that. We are resourcing them from a consolidated fund or whatever, because the ramifications of breaches are such that the bills that we'll have to pay eventually are so huge that, I mean, they justify the kind of investment that we should have from a source like the consolidated fund, for instance, to make sure that some of these things are well executed.
Now, quickly, let me go back on the phone line, and Mr. Vitus Azim from Ghana Integrity Initiative. What is the way forward? Tell me.
You see, the way forward, I think, I have just 3 questions that we should ask. And if they give answers to these 3 questions, we should know where we're going to. 1, where were the vehicles kept for these 11 years? 2, why did the NDC wait for this election year to raise up this issue? What did they do from 2009 when they moved the cars to the Institute of Local Government in 2009? What did they do about the vehicles and the negotiations with the supplier? And why did the NPP refuse the 86 vehicles when they had paid for some of these vehicles? As we're talking about documents being bent, if you come to me saying that we owe you some money, you should produce copies of the documents that show that we owe you some money. And as for heaven, politicians don't believe in heaven. Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing the things that they are doing. But the way forward is that we have laws, we should enforce those laws and sanction people that contravene those laws.
Now, quickly, Mr. Abrampa Mensah, CDD, if you're there, beyond these 87 vehicles, you know, there are more others. We're not focusing on only these 87 vehicles. How do we reverse this worrying trend?
It's a bit difficult question, and I don't think I will have answers right now. But what I will say is, as we all say, we need strong institutions manned by committed personnel. If we have all these things in place, and we have a well-resourced, as Salom has just said, departments, institutions, I don't think any political activist or political party can maneuver the system. So what we need is strong institutions, well-resourced institutions, manned by committed Ghanaians or committed personnel who go around all this. Because the politician will not stand up from his office, just go through bypassing all his technocrats to go and negotiate and sign contracts. Definitely, they'll be worked through our technocrats that we know, we trust, and we have. Not that they're not competent. We have competent staff here who do well when they travel outside the country. So we have them there. So that the problem is they will have to be a bit more committed to the nation. That's exactly what we need. And
quickly, Lawyer Bochi.
Well, I think that Parliament needs to step up the plates. Parliament needs to take the leadership position, leadership responsibility in this regard. I think Parliament needs to remember that on such occasion, we need a bipartisan approach. I would expect that Parliament should set up a committee specifically into this matter and to do some public hearing. Finally, I would just wish to say that government needs to remember that it stands in a trusteeship position as regards the management of the resources of Ghana according to the Constitution. In that regard, government needs to ensure that there's an efficient and effective deployment of state resources. It doesn't seem that, and I'm speaking about government once again in the continuity. I'm not speaking about the NDC government, I'm speaking about all the governments that have been responsible for such a rather bizarre scenario. We should ensure that it doesn't get repeated, because clearly it does demonstrate a certain failure of both political and administrative leadership, and I think that's a worrying sign.
Thank you very much. PM Express, you heard the arguments. We need bipartisan approaches to handling these things. We need strong institutions and strong systems. Thank you, gentlemen.